On January 7th, 1939, Scharnhorst entered service with Captain Otto Ciliax appointed as the first commander. Preliminary tests revealed a number of shortcomings in various systems and equipment of the ship, including new boilers, and this required significant alternations and improvements. Insufficient height of the side of the bow and a trim by the bow were discovered. In August, the bow was redesigned, the aircraft hangar was enlarged, and a tripod mainmast was installed. On September 2nd, Scharnhorst made a short test run, after which it was necessary to carry out a number of works on the boiler's superheated tubes. Having crossed to the Baltic Sea together with Gneisenau, during training shooting she received damage to the hangar and the seaplane on the middle catapult, and also experienced problems with the central turbine. After 2 weeks of repairs at the shipyard, Scharnhorst returned to the North Sea. Otto Ciliax, who had been promoted to the rank of Contra-Admiral, was replaced as the ship's commander by Captain Kurt Hoffmann. September 1st, 1939, Gneisenau met in full combat readiness. The coat of arms and name were removed from the hull, and the fire hazardous boats were removed. At the same time, a radiogram was transmitted from Gneisenau to Scharnhorst. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau acted together twice, performing heroic deeds and remaining faithful to each other. Let the same thing await us a third time. We wish our twin sister good luck on the campaign. On September 3rd, the fleet received a signal to begin military operations against England, and the following day, Gneisenau, along with Scharnhorst, was attacked by 14 Wellington bombers of the British Air Force at anchor in Brunsbüttel, the mouth of the Elbe, but without any damage. However, Luftwaffe fighters managed to shoot down 2 English planes. On September 8th, both ships passed through the Kiel Canal to practice gunfiring on the old battleship Hessen and to conduct minor repairs at the Kiel shipyard. After a trial run into the Baltic Sea, Gneisenau returned to the North Sea through the Kiel Canal on October 5th. On October 8th, Gneisenau, together with the light cruiser Köln and 9 destroyers, put to sea to distract the Anglo-French forces hunting for Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee. Discovered by British air reconnaissance, this group was only able to reach Utsira Island near the southern coast of Norway, and then returned to Kiel via Skagerrak and Kattegat. Later, the flagship was joined by Scharnhorst. On October 14th, they participated in the ceremonial meeting of the submarine U-47, which sank the British battleship Royal Oak. Gneisenau, under flag of the new commander of the battle fleet, Vice Admiral Wilhelm Marschall, and Scharnhorst, accompanied by the light cruisers Leipzig, Köln, and 3 destroyers, left Wilhelmshaven on 21st November 1939 to attack British patrol vessels between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. This operation was intended to distract French and British ships from the South Atlantic, where they were tightening the ring around the raider Admiral Graf Spee. As soon as both battle cruisers passed the minefields, the light ships returned to base due to a strong storm. In line formation, with Gneisenau in the lead and Scharnhorst 20 kilometers to the starboard rear, they headed out at 27 knots into the open sea, which was raging with a violent storm. The waves damaged both ships' hulls, and water began to enter their bow turrets and magazines. They had to reduce speed to 12 knots. At 4 p.m. on 23rd November, Scharnhorst spotted the auxiliary cruiser Rawalpindi, a former liner armed with 8 obsolete 152mm guns. She was the easternmost ship in a cruiser patrol that also included the new Newcastle and the obsolete Delhi, Calypso and Ceres. At 5 p.m., Scharnhorst opened fire on the virtually defenseless ship, and 8 minutes later, Gneisenau joined in. At 5:06, a salvo of 283mm shells hit the auxiliary cruiser's superstructure, killing Captain E. Kennedy and most of the officers. Large fires broke out among the pile of debris. 10 minutes later, German fire turned Ravensbrück into a blazing wreck, slowly sinking into the water. In total, Gneisenau fired 53 283mm and 125 150mm shells, while Scharnhorst fired 89 283mm and 109 150mm shells, but was also hit in the stern by a 152mm shell. They were wounded and minor damage from shrapnel. At 5:16, they ceased to fire due to the lack of a target. Ravensbrück sank. Vice Admiral Marshall assigned Scharnhorst to pick the surviving British sailors. However, Newcastle, which soon appeared, forced the Germans to halt this activity and quickly left the battlefield under cover of a smokescreen. They lay to the north in order to wait for bad weather to return to base. Due to the poor visibility, the enemies weren't able to accurately recognize each other. The British believed that Ravensbrück sank Deutschland with the help of the cruiser Emden, so they initially sent only light cruisers armed with 152mm artillery to help. The Germans, though, not knowing what forces are in front of them, missed an excellent opportunity to deal with the 4 cruisers after Ravensbrück. For such hesitancy, as well as for the large expenditure of shells in sinking the auxiliary vessel, Vice Admiral Marshall was later harshly criticized by the command, although German propaganda hastened to declare this campaign a major success for German weapons. The return journey took place in the same stormy weather, and the ships were again damaged. Water flooded the boat turrets, as well as, through cracks between the deformed plating, the forward crew quarters. Due to the insufficient height of the site, the battle cruisers took on water with the entire bows for most of the journey, and icy cold floes even flooded the bridges and platforms of the forward superstructure, so that control had to be transferred to the conning tower. The Allies sent powerful forces of battleships and battlecruisers, Hood, Dunkirk, Nelson, Rodney, in pursuit, but the raiders, having passed through the straits between Bergen and the Shetland Islands, safely returned to Wilhelmshaven on November 27th to repair storm damage. At the same time, the boilers of Scharnhorst were repaired, and the bow of Gneisenau, which had moved to Kiel, was again rebuilt during a 7-week repair at a naval shipyard. In November, a new commander, Harald Netzband, was appointed to the ladder. The British did not want to accept the fact that the German raiders had let them go unpunished, and on December 17th, they launched a raid on Wilhelmshaven with 24 Wellington bombers. Scharnhorst, which was parked there, fired her anti-aircraft guns for 8 minutes, but was ineffective. The cranes and buildings of the shipyard were in the way, but the Messerschmitts shot down 10 planes. On January 11th, 1940, Scharnhorst moved to Kiel, where she joined Gneisenau for exercises and gunnery practice, which began on 15th January. But the winter was too cold for the ships to return to their home base. On February 4th, Gneisenau, and a day later Scharnhorst, left for Wilhelmshaven. On February 18th, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and 2 destroyers left the mouths of the Jade River to attack British convoys to Norway. Having reached the passage near the Shetland Islands without encountering a single ship, the commander of the operation, Admiral Marshall, led the forces back to base on February 20th. On April 7th, 1940, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, Admiral Hipper and 14 destroyers were steaming along the coast of Norway at 24 knots, heading for Trondheim and Narvik. The invasion of Norway was planned to be launched by the Navy and Army simultaneously from the north and south. Admiral Hipper and the destroyers carried landing troops, and the battlecruisers provided cover for the landing. As soon as they tried to increase the speed to 27 knots, a steam valve on Scharnhorst failed, which led to a 15-minute stop of the left shaft. A couple of hours later, the German squadron heading for Narvik and Trondheim was attacked by 12 Blenheim bombers of Royal Air Forces. The two battleships and the heavy cruiser, moving in frontal formation, opened anti-aircraft fire from all barrels. There was a lot of noise and smoke, which cannot be said about hits on the planes. They responded in kind. All 40 bombs missed. 3 more squadrons were prevented from attacking by German Bf-110 fighter escorts, which managed to shoot down 2 Wellingtons. But the British pilots reported the enemy's location, and at 8:15 p.m. the home fleet put to sea, assuming that the Germans were planning a powerful attack on shipping in the North Atlantic. By evening, the weather had worsened, an 8-point storm had broken out, and the radars had to be turned on. Again, the German ships began to suffer from the ocean waves, barely maintaining 9 knots. At about 8 a.m. on April 8th, approximately 100 miles from Trondheim, the destroyer Bernd von Arnim, looking through a snow squall, discovered British destroyer Glowworm, located somewhat to the west of Trondheim, which had fallen behind its unit of battlecruiser Renown, light cruiser Birmingham and destroyers. After a brief battle, in which Admiral Hipper and 4 destroyers took part, Glowworm sank at 9:24, trying to ram the German cruiser before sinking. Admiral Hipper did not receive serious damage and, together with 4 destroyers, headed for Trondheim. Around 9 p.m., the remaining 10 destroyers with landing forces separated to attack Narvik. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau took up position west of the Westfjorden. On Scharnhorst, water entered the number 2 fuel tank through the air intake, and the speed had to be reduced to 7 knots. During the night, water entered the fuel tanks of Gneisenau through the ventilation shafts, rendering 470 cubic meters of oil unusable. Low clouds, frequent rain and snow charges severely limited visibility, especially in the western direction from where the enemy could appear. Admiral Lutenz's ships were 50 miles west of the southern end of the Lofoten Islands. At 4:30 a.m. on April 9th, the radar on Gneisenau detected a large target 25 kilometers astern, and the ships declared general quarters. Still not trusting the radar, the commander of Gneisenau, Captain Netzband, ordered the artillery officer to check the contact with rangefinders. The radars of Scharnhorst were still not giving contact, and rain and low clouds limited visibility. Around 5 a.m., the navigator of Scharnhorst detected a flash of heavy gunfire in the mirror of the sextant, and 5 minutes later, the signalman saw the silhouette of a large ship. It was Renown, which opened fire on Gneisenau from a distance of 11.8 kilometers with 381mm guns. The Germans responded a minute later, and at 5:18 a.m., Renown transferred fire to Scharnhorst. Lutyens ordered the turn away from the enemy, but Netzband asked the admiral for permission to turn left so that the forward turrets could fire. The artillery duel continued sporadically until 6 a.m. and then, after a 20-minute pause, until 7:15 a.m. 5 minutes after opening fire, Gneisenau, using radar, scored 2 hits on the enemy ship. One 283mm shell penetrated the tripod support of Renault foremast and flew overboard without exploding. The second hit the starboard side in the area of the stern turret between the upper and main decks, above the steering gear compartment, flew through the entire ship, and having penetrated the left side, also fell into the sea. Almost simultaneously, Gneisenau received two 381mm shells. The first penetrated the director's turret, damaged many electrical cables, and flew overboard without exploding. The shrapnel killed the senior artillery officer and 5 sailors, wounded 8 or 9 people, destroyed the optical rangefinders of the bow 150mm guns, and the director's turret was moved to the stern. The second shell damaged the stern 283mm gun turret, which ceased fire for the rest of the battle. After the hits, Gneisenau ceased fire and increased speed. The Germans had already determined that Renown was accompanied by 8 destroyers, which could have finished off their ships with torpedoes if they had been damaged or had slowed down. Gneisenau fired 60 283mm and 8 150mm shells, and Scharnhorst 195 283mm shells and several 150mm. The latter failed to score a hit, possibly due to a broken radar. Renown's ammunition expenditure was much greater, about 230 381mm and 1065 114mm, a bit much for 2 or 3 hits, even taking into account the weather and the enemy's frequent course changes. The German ships left the battle at high speed. Despite the modifications made to their hulls, they took on huge amounts of water in the stormy sea, which cascaded into the main deck and the forward turrets deployed beyond the port beam. Due to the penetration of water into the electrical circuits of the ammunition elevator of Gneisenau forward turret, a short circuit occurred. And on Scharnhorst, the forward turret failed under the impact of heavy waves. Water entered the turret through the ejection holes for spent cartridges, rangefinder casings, and gun embrasures. A short circuit occurred in the circuits of the electric motors for feeding ammunitions due to the ingress of salt water. When Scharnhorst tried to increase speed to its fullest, the starboard turbine had to be stopped, which is why the speed dropped to 25 knots. Renown and her destroyers rushed in pursuit, firing continuously from medium-caliber guns. Frequent flashes of gunfire from the destroyers made the Germans assume that they were being pursued by a powerful force. However, they managed to increase the distance and go first to the north and then to the west, further into the Arctic Ocean, where they remained for several days before risking returning to Germany. During this time, Scharnhorst managed to fix the problem with the mechanisms and was able to give 28 knots. On April 12th, the battle cruisers in the North Sea joined Admiral Hipper and arrived in Wilhelmshaven in the evening. On the final leg of the route, the British threw more than 90 bombers against the elusive enemy, but they were unable to find the target, and the German fighters that appeared shot down at least a dozen of them. The battle with Renown forced German distant cover forces to retreat north, leaving their assigned patrol area near the Lofoten Islands. As a result, the British managed to suddenly attack the destroyers in Narvik on April 10th and 13th. The loss of these 10 modern ships was the first serious blow to the Kriegsmarine. Scharnhorst needed serious repairs to her bow turret and power plant. But all the hopes of her commander to be put into dry dock were buried by an order from the High Command, which prohibited starting any repairs that required more than 6 hours. On May 1st, the ship moved to Wesermünde and 9 days later to the Baltic in order to undergo a course of combat training in a calm environment necessary for 87 newly arrived officers. After a week in the Gotenhafen area, Scharnhorst was recalled to Kiel for long-awaited repairs. The Deutsche Werke shipyard requested 12 days for the work, but the fleet commander demanded that everything be completed by May 31st. The thing is, by this time of the heavy German ships, only Scharnhorst and Gneisenau remained in service. Lutzow was repairing torpedo damage, and Admiral Xi was undergoing scheduled repairs, and the events in Norway required the presence of Kriegsmarine ships off its shores. Having strained themselves, the shipyard made the specified deadline. Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, Admiral Hippe and 4 destroyers set out on June 4th to attack enemy naval forces in the Harstad area of the coast of Norway. The operation was planned to be carried out in close cooperation with the Luftwaffe, so for better identification, the roofs of the turret of the German ships were painted red. At the first stage, the squadron was accompanied by 2 minesweepers and 2 Jaguar-class destroyers. On June 8th, at 5:55 am, Admiral Hippe discovered and sank the British escort trawler Jupiter, and Gneisenau set fire to the tanker Oil Pioneer with 150mm guns, which was finished off by a torpedo from a destroyer at about 8 am. Seaplanes were sent up from Admiral Hippe and Gneisenau to spot the convoys, and soon they reported a cruiser and a merchant ship to the south of the German force, and a passenger ship with a hospital ship to the north. Admiral Hippe and the destroyers were sent north, where they intercepted and sank the passenger ship Orama, also managing to jam her distress signals, but did not attack the hospital ship Atlantis. Following these events, Admiral Marshall decided to send the destroyers and Admiral Hippe, which were short of fuel, to Trondheim for refueling, while he himself, with 2 battle cruisers, headed for the Harstad area. Here, off the coast of Norway, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau achieved their greatest success of the war. At 4:46 p.m., the observer on Scharnhorst spotted smoke at 60 degrees, and 24 minutes later, her senior gunner reported that he had an Ark Royal-class aircraft carrier in his sight. This was the aircraft carrier Glorious, escorted by the destroyers Acasta and Ardent, which was evacuating 2 fighter squadrons from Norway. Of course, she could not use these aircrafts to attack the enemy, and what could fighters do to battleships? But for some unknown reason, none of her torpedo bombers, 6 swordfishes, were ready to launch. And without prepared strike aircrafts, the ship was virtually defenseless, having only 16 120mm guns, in addition to 8 more on the 2 destroyers. But what was she doing there? Since June 2nd, Glorious had been providing air support for the evacuation of Allied troops, Operation Alphabet, near Narvik, as part of Vice Admiral Wells' carrier task force, Ark Royal, Glorious and 5 destroyers. On June 9th, both carriers were to join the escort of the 2nd large Allied convoy leaving Narvik, but on the morning of June 8th, Glorious commander Captain Doyle Hughes asked Admiral Wells for permission to proceed immediately to the base in Scapa Flow. The reason for this request was an intense conflict between the carrier's commander and the air group chief, Commander Heath, which required an urgent decision by a military court at the base. According to another version, Glorious needed to urgently return to the base due to the depletion of fuel reserves. After receiving permission, Glorious, accompanied by the destroyers Ardent and Acasta, moved toward the homeland. It should be noted that in the Norwegian campaign, single carrier crossings with minimal escorts were typical for the Royal Navy, as the British command did not expect the appearance of large enemy surface forces here. During the passage, the aircraft carrier's air group did not conduct air patrols, although if the enemy had been detected in advance, Glorious, which was not inferior in speed to the German battleships, could have avoided combat and report the enemy to other British ships. However, Glorious aircrafts were in hangars, and none of them were ready for takeoff. The refusal to conduct air reconnaissance was explained by the fact that, due to the northwest wind, the aircraft carrier would have to take a return course to launch and land the aircrafts. At that time, there were 35 aircrafts on the carrier, of which 6 were Swordfish torpedo bombers, and the rest were Gladiator and Hurricane fighters. The carrier was making 17 knots and zigzagging to avoid submarines. To save fuel, 12 of the 18 boilers were running, which prevented the carrier from quickly reaching maximum speed if necessary. Despite the clear weather, no visual observation was conducted from the mast and superstructures. As a result, unknown ships in the western part of the horizon were only spotted by the Glorious at 5 p.m. Captain Doyle Hughes gave the order to raise swordfishes from the hangar and prepare them for takeoff. The destroyer Ardent was sent to identify the unknown ships. After they failed to respond to the destroyer's searchlight request, Glorious sounded the general quarters at 5:20 p.m. In a daytime combat at line-of-sight distances, naval artillery played a decisive role. In this regard, the 2 German battleships, each armed with 9 283mm, 12 150mm and 14 105mm guns, had an overwhelming advantage over the British aircraft carrier and 2 destroyers. The British destroyers had powerful torpedo armament, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes on each, but in order to successfully use torpedoes, they would have to close with the enemy to a distance of guaranteed destruction by artillery fire. Glorious did not have time to use its main armament, the Swordfish strike aircrafts. At 5:38 p.m., the 3rd salvo from Scharnhorst covered Glorious and she received first hit. 283mm shell penetrated the upper deck and exploded in the hangar, causing a fire there. Due to the destruction of the deck, it became impossible for aircraft to take off from the carrier. The 2 swordfishes that had been raised to the deck were thrown into the water by the explosion. The aircraft carrier was completely disarmed, since its 120mm artillery could not reach the enemy at such a distance. At 5:46, Gneisenau joined the shelling of Glorious. While firing their main caliber at Glorious, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau simultaneously fired 150mm guns at the destroyer Ardent, which had close to them. Ardent was hit in the boiler room almost immediately. At 5:42, she fired a 4 torpedo salvo at Scharnhorst, ineffective due to the great distance, and scored 1 hit with a 120mm gun. The smoke screen she laid was unable to hide Glorious from the enemy. Only half an hour after the general quarters was declared, and already under fire from 2 battleships, the commander of Glorious finally gave the order to change course to close in on the enemy. The aircraft carrier made a sharp turn to the southeast. She was able to increase her speed to 26 knots, but the German battleships did not lag behind and even reduced the distance to 21 kilometers. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau fired without a haste, carefully adjusting fire and observing. At 5:56, Glorious was hit a second time. 283mm shell exploded on the carrier's breech and killed everyone there, including the ship's commander. Senior officer Lovell assumed command. 2 minutes later, the aircraft carrier managed to temporarily hide from the shelling behind a smoke screen laid by the destroyer Acasta. At the same time, the destroyer Ardent emerged from behind the smoke and fired a second torpedo salvo at the German ships, but like the first one, it was ineffective, and the German battleships evaded the torpedoes. The destroyer again came under fire from the medium caliber of German battleships and, heavily damaged, sank at 6:22 p.m. At this time, Germans had already noticed Glorious in the gap in the smoke screen and resumed shelling her with their main caliber. Gneisenau immediately achieved target coverage. 283mm shell exploded in the aircraft carrier's engine room and caused fatal damage to the ship. Engulfed in flames, Glorious lost control and began to move in a circle with an increasing least to starboard. It became clear that the aircraft carrier was doomed. The second British destroyer, Acasta, had no damage and could have tried to escape. However, Acasta rushed at full speed to intersect the course of the German battleships. Passing in front of them under heavy fire, Germans even fired at her from anti-aircraft guns. Acasta fired 2 torpedo salvos. Gneisenau evaded the torpedoes, but at 6:39, one of them hit Scharnhorst on the starboard side near the stern turret. The torpedo hit had serious consequences for the battleship. Due to flooding through an underwater hole, Scharnhorst sank by the stern by 3 meters. Only one of the 3 propeller shafts worked. The stern main caliber turret and 1 medium caliber turret were out of order. 48 people died in the explosion. Germans no longer fired at the sinking Glorious, concentrating their fire on Acasta, which received multiple hits, lost speed, but continued to fire to the end from 2 surviving stern guns and achieved another hit with a 120mm shell on Scharnhorst. Around 7:08 p.m., Glorious capsized and sunk. The valiant Acasta survived her only by 9 minutes, having fulfilled her duty as an escort destroyer to the end. Since Glorious was constantly radioing her position, calling for help from the home fleet, the German ships hurried to take refuge in Trondheim. Interestingly, this was the first clash between battleships and an aircraft carrier, and the only one in which the former gained the upper hand. The severe damage of Scharnhorst forced Admiral Marshall to abandon further operations against the Allied convoys and urgently return to base. At 7:15 p.m., Gneisenau and Scharnhorst set course for Trondheim without helping British floating in the icy water and lay of fuel oil. The few survivors were later picked up from life rafts by Norwegian ships. 39 of the rescued were delivered to Great Britain, 7 to occupied Norway. The number of those killed from Glorious, Ardent and Acasta was 1,520 men. During the battle, Glorious kept sending radiograms reporting that she was under attack by the German battleships. The radiograms were transmitted in poor radio conditions and on the wrong frequency, which the British ships were not supposed to switch to until the following day. However, one of the messages was received by the cruiser Devonshire. Since the cruiser was carrying members of the Norwegian royal family and government evacuated from Tromsø, Vice Admiral John Cunningham, who was on Devonshire, ordered radio silence. If Germans had continued the operation, this could have played a fatal role for the second convoy, moving on under the protection of only 2 light cruisers and 5 destroyers, transporting 10,000 Allied personnel from Narvik. The British command first learned of the appearance of the German battleships only on the morning of June 9th, when the hospital ship Atlantis encountered the battleship Valiant at sea, which immediately turned to protect the second Narvik convoy. The commander of the home fleet, Admiral Forbes, learned of the loss of Glorious only in the afternoon from a German radio message. The battleships Rodney and Renown were urgently sent to search for the German squadron. On June 10th, Admiral Marshall left Trondheim to intercept the Allied convoys with the battleship Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hippe and 4 destroyers, but the Allied transports had already changed course, leaving the danger zone. German reconnaissance aircraft detected the approach of the main forces of the British home fleet, after which Marshall abandoned the operation entirely. Thus, the great success of the Kriegsmarine, the destruction of the British aircraft carrier, cannot be considered a complete victory for the German fleet. The loss of Glorious, which was caused by the mistakes of British intelligence, which overlooked the appearance of large enemy surface forces near Narvik, as well as the omissions of the ship's commander himself, nevertheless thwarted the enemy's plans and saved the transports of a large Allied convoy from possible destruction, thanks to the heroic actions of the destroyers Ardent and Acasta against the German battleships, which were many times superior in strength.